This is our first webinar of the year, isn't it, Rich?
Yeah.
The first one in a series. I think most of you would have seen that we've got that list of webinars. Is it 9 in total?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, 9 in total. And this is the first one, and we're starting off on home territory in a sense, and something that we're both particularly passionate about, which is parent advocacy, peer parental advocacy, parental representation in the child protection system. And yeah, it's a good one for us to start on the front foot, isn't it, Rich? Something we're really passionate about. Yeah, and there's a wide-ranging conversation happening about this topic, isn't there, at the moment? Really seems to be something that is being talked about in organisations, talked about in the community, and obviously, and as there always has been, there are individuals that are having that conversation, individuals that need help and need advocacy. And so there's lots of expertise out there carried in all those different conversations and interest in the topic. And we really are feeling that, and have been connecting with different forums and different organisations. But today is particularly about our context, and our context, myself, Tim Fisher, I work for the London Borough of Camden. My context as somebody that's working inside the local authority to develop parental advocacy, and yours as well, Rich. We're coming at it from a personal perspective, this one, aren't we?
Yeah. So I'll just introduce myself. My name's Rich Devine, and I'm a social worker. I work for Bath and North East Somerset Council, and I'm really excited to be delivering this webinar with Tim, because he's been in and around this space for at least 10 years, 10, 15 years. And there feels like there's a cultural shift occurring at the moment in relation to parental advocacy, where it's been picking up momentum over the last kind of few years in particular. And that's been kind of cemented, I would say, in the last year or two, with it being a key recommendation within the care review. And so it's kind of entered into a kind of the consciousness, I suppose, of social workers and parents who are on the receiving end of services. And it's becoming much more prevalent and much more talked about now. And so we're hopefully going to share our experiences and what we've learned in our journey of understanding parental advocacy, and where it can work, and also where it, it's not a panacea, but it can definitely create some significant shifts and changes in the way that we support parents.
Yeah, and there's we're in the future webinars, we're going to circle back. I've been saying the term circle back a lot recently. I went on this American webinar. Some of you might have, or this American conference, some of you might have connected with that. It's called the Kemp Center. It's worth looking up, actually. K-E-M-P-E, Kemp. And the Americans on there talk about circling back to things all the time. And I've picked that up as a verbal tick. So we'll be circling back to peer parental advocacy later in this series of webinars, and we've got one which some of you might have come to last year, which is really live and direct and vivid, and it's parents with lived experience talking about their experiences of being an advocate and receiving advocacy services. So look out for that one later in the year. The other reason why I particularly wanted to collaborate with Rich Devine is because of his skill and proclivity around assembling the evidence and putting it out there. And so and that's, I think, what we've got in the mix today. We've got Rich bringing the evidence that peer parental advocacy does work. It's the right thing to do, yes, but it also works as well. So we get the benefit of that for this lunchtime. We've framed these up as webinar style. We alluded to earlier that we are more used to a conversation format, and with working alongside people with lived experience, we decided for this to sort of just give you the evidence and give something clear and concise in your lunch breaks. So well, that's going to be the main format today. It's going to be Rich and I presenting some evidence to you. We'll hopefully get a bit of a chance at the end for contributions. It might be 5 minutes at the end if we have time. But as I said, later in the year we'll be coming back with some more collaborative sessions. Yeah. And,
nice. Should we jump into it then?
Let's go for it, Rich. Yeah.
Do you want to move us to the next slide?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So just to begin with, a definition of parental advocacy. There's a really excellent paper by David Tobis and his colleagues where they provide a kind of overview. It's a literature review, and they examine 100 studies, and they provide a good definition of parental advocacy, but which they describe as a form of peer advocacy where parents who themselves have had experience of child welfare or the child protection system can help other parents involved currently to navigate it. And in addition, they also help them to develop strategies to change the system. So there's kind of two elements to it, really. The first is around parents who've been through or involved with the child protection system and have navigated that relatively successfully can then support parents who are currently involved in the system. And then secondly, there's a kind of developing collectives or groups or organizations where they think about, from a parent's point of view, how we can change the system so that it's more in alignment with some of their ideas around what would be helpful.
Sorry, Rich, there's a bit of delay on these. Yeah.
That's okay. And so here's some kind of key quotes that we've pulled out in relation to why parental advocacy is worth considering or pursuing or even implementing in your organisation. So Jill Berwick and her colleagues have done a lot of research in this, and they call it a new and significant evidence-based strategy for supporting families in their efforts to reunify, and they consider it show an important premise. Jill Berwick is from the USA, so they're probably a bit ahead of us in the UK. Cohen and Cannon talk about the inclusion of parents within professional child protection has the potential to initiate a transformative or transformational change process. Sears calls it a paradigm shift. Bridge Featherstone and her colleagues in a book called Protecting Children, which if you haven't read already, I'd really recommend. It's actually the book where I first learned about the idea of parental advocacy. They talk about that the parents have built up an unparalleled knowledge of the range of welfare systems, and that they have like skills and knowledge that could be utilised through a co-production to arrive at transformative approaches that function at the levels of practice, service design, and indeed policy. David Tobis, who wrote a book called From Pariah to Parents, this book basically detailed how the child protection system in New York underwent a transformation that was spearheaded by parents who were on the receiving end of services that were unhappy or dissatisfied with the support that they received, and the results were quite astonishing, really. From what I remember, during a 20-year period, there was a significant reduction in the number of children in care, from something like 49,000 in 1992 to 13,000 in 2012. Now, obviously, there was a multitude of reasons for this reduction, but the book really illustrates the effectiveness of parental advocacy as a way of helping children and families. And here's a quote where they talk about it not solely being a matter of justice or sympathy or desire to be nice to parents, which is an ideological point of view, but it's a critically important thing to do to help children. And then, as we noted at the beginning, the care review by Josh McAllister, identifying it as a source of potential exploration in the way that we help children and families. So I'll hand it back to you, Tim, now.
Okay. So this is our story in Camden, and I've highlighted in orange some of the points and I think are questions that we might all be thinking about, actually. in the different groups and conversations and different ways in which we're interested in this work. You know, why are we on the call today? Why are we particularly interested in parent advocacy? I think we're asking ourselves some of these questions, and in Camden, you know, how we started the conversation. I mean, it bubbled up quite naturally, really, with a coffee morning, and that became a family advisory board, a group of parents that wanted to meet regularly and wanted to make some changes in Camden. And so there was a co-design process for us there. I mean, co-design is a fancy buzz term in some ways at the moment, isn't it? And again, it's something that we're going to I can't say circle back. It's one of the things that we're going to return to in one of the later webinars. But this piece of participatory research, Camden Conversations, was really fundamental, and it was parents that were driving that, parents that had come to the coffee mornings and wanted to do this piece where they asked others in Camden, you know, about their experiences, and then came up with some recommendations about things they wanted to do differently. And the big one, the top of the list, top of the pops, the thing that people really wanted was peer support, peer parental advocacy. And a lot of people mentioned it, and it came out as a top recommendation of Camden Conversations. And when I moved to start thinking about like why, you know, and our why, and you might have your own why and your own connection to this, but you know, for me, I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's really important, but it's and that's a good thing in and of itself. But the fact that the community are requesting it, the fact that there was a process of parents deciding that that was the direction that they wanted to take, it imbues the advocacy in Camden with more meaning, I think, and it enables it to have more potential to that bubbling under and that sort of growth that started at that first coffee morning nearly 10 years ago now. It has more energy. The advocacy has more energy because it's not been designed on a page by professionals in Camden. It's actually something that that parents have imagined themselves and have imagined working and have requested and have said that it's something that they need. And that is what happened in New York as well. So you definitely need you need a team. I mean, I know I've referenced all the expertise and the brilliant people on this call, and there's definitely some really important people in the Camden parent advocacy team on the call. We talked about, you know, this coalition of, I think it's something that was said in Leeds when they redesigned their social services. The phrase they used about a coalition of the willing. So you get people around, allies, a mix of lived and learned experience that people are going to really make the change happen, both local and international as well. David Tobis came with Andy Bilson as well to the Camden Conversations launch in Camden in 2019. And we're lucky to have such a great group of people who've got parents and professionals that worked in Camden for a while. I mentioned the word provocateur there. You know, there's people like Seth Oliver, the artist, that have really helped people think differently and help us make this work what it is. So we kind of took to talking about Camden as a village. You know, we started really imagining Camden, trying to think that we could you know and get to know and understand the needs of the people in Camden, and we feel like it's not something you can just drop in. Like, parent advocacy, I'm speaking just from the journey in Camden, but I don't think it's something you can just drop into place. You know, okay, let's design this professional intervention and let's set it in place. You know, I feel like that wouldn't have worked. And I think the success of it has been the fact that as well as starting something new, we've also got to change some of the mainstream practices. We've also got to shift what's there. And in order to do that, there's a commitment there from people that are doing the work, a commitment to, in our daily work, in our daily practices, try and make the change by building relationships with people, by doing things differently. And part of that is about leadership as well. And, you know, you might be asking and thinking about what leadership, who you need around you in your organisation or area to make a move towards parent advocacy. And leadership is really needed. That sort of traditional leadership and sponsorship of senior people sometimes in an organisation, but leadership comes in many forms. And you know, the parents in Camden that got us kick-started with Camden Conversations have driven the work, and now the human engine that are doing the advocacy work and are meeting with the parents and are providing the advocacy representation, that's real leadership. So leadership comes in different forms, and you find it in different places for sure. And we were lucky really to have this kind of context. I don't know why I've used the word incubate. That's a bit of a fancy word, isn't it? But how do you, how I've mentioned bubbling, and I'm eating a lot of fermented foods at the moment, maybe that's why. But it's like what's your context, and how are you enabling things to grow? And we had a family good conference service. We have a family good conference service in Camden that's well established, and has family good conference facilitators that have got a mix of lived and learned experience, some of which were trained as advocates, and so they could transfer quite quickly into the practice, while at the same time we developed with other boroughs in London an OCN level 2 training course, and started training some of the parents that were part of the Camden Conversations move. Part of the parents that called for parent advocacy are the ones that got trained. And so now we've got this nice mix of FGC facilitators that have been around for a long time, and we've also got some of which have got lived experience as well, and we've got lived experience advocates providing the advocacy and work in Camden. And you've got that kind of, not maybe for want of a better word, a sort of brand that developed around it. Rich mentioned earlier the David Tobis and from pariahs to partners, and this notion of partnership. There's lots of language and different words, and the sort of academic catch-all seems to be peer parental advocacy at the moment. The recent independent review and government consultation document, white paper, talks about parental representation. So there's different language around it, but the parents in Camden and this co-design really alighted on this idea about parent support partners, and this visual metaphor of a bridge, and the fact that advocacy was a bridge of support and a bridge building trust between professionals and community, between family, parent and social worker. Yeah. Rich.
Sorry guys, I muted myself and then I couldn't unmute myself.
I just had to ask to unmute you, yeah.
Blocked everybody's mute button. I was trying to be careful about the sound. When I did the research, which I did heavily in conjunction with Clive Diaz, and hopefully we'll have a paper coming out at some point this year. They talk about kind of proximal and distal goals, and the proximal goals are essentially the kind of softer goals or the short-term goals or outcomes, and they're in relation to helping parents understand how to engage with children's services, increased motivation to access support, understanding the implications of their actions or inactions. For example, if they change or don't change, what might be the response from children's social care, the benefits to the advocates by taking on those roles, and the improved relationships between social workers. So there are some of the kind of proximal shorter term goals that were found in the research. And then the distal goals were around improving the chance of the parents caring for children when at risk of removal, and improving the likelihood of reunification when children have been removed. Now, there is evidence in favour of that, but we'll touch on it in a little bit about some of the kind of methodological challenges of the research that's been undertaken that's kind of proved those findings. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Tim. When I did the research, Jill Berwick, she and her colleague, they identified 3 themes when they were interviewing parents who received parental advocacy in terms of the potential benefits. And then I found those 3 themes in one of these papers. And then when I was reading all of the other papers, and I think I read pretty much all of the literature on parental advocacy, these themes kept coming up. And so to kind of structure the paper that I wrote in the presentation today, we're going to use those 3 themes, which are the value of shared experience is the first theme. The second theme is communication, and then the third theme is support. And I tried to pull out the quotes from the parents to kind of reveal to reveal those themes rather than just bore you with the details of the studies and how they found what they found, etc., etc. So the first theme was around the value of shared experience. And parents often described the benefit of being supported by someone who'd been in the situation that they were currently in, and could really empathise with their situation. The challenge as a social worker when we're working with parents is we can have some sympathy for what they're going through and try to convey empathy, but it's always limited by the degree that for most social workers, they haven't been in the experience that the parent has been in. And so what that meant is that sometimes the shared experience meant that parents were more trustful of their advocates and were more receptive in terms of willingness to engage and accept support from them. And this quote from a parent at the top here, I think it really speaks to that. The parent writes, "She gives you strength. She makes you stand tall through it all. And especially because your parent partner can kind of tell you what they went through, the situation they went through. And it's like, whoa, you went through all of that and you got your kids and you're doing good. I can do this. I can do this." So receiving support from someone with a similar background or having shared experiences could be a source of kind of inspiration and reveal to the parent who's kind of going through a really difficult time what could be made available, what is possible. And then if we move on to the next slide, please, Tim. The second area was around communication. One of the kind of areas around that kind of bridge the gap between the shared experience and the communication is around just the sheer complexity of the child protection system. I know, for example, when I was a social worker, when I first qualified, it took me 5, 6, 7 months to understand what the processes were in the team that I worked in terms of what child in need meant, what child protection meant, what pre-proceedings meant. Never mind then having to learn about the various different teams and sub-departments within the teams and who was responsible for what. And then there's obviously all of the kind of language challenges. And so parent advocates who've been through and had lots of experience of the system are a lot more familiar with the language and the different teams, and they can help parents who are under immense levels of stress often when at the point that we become involved to navigate and make sense of the system. And the other way that the advocate functioned as was a kind of transitional figure between them and the services, especially in relation to translating, as I just mentioned, some of the social work jargon and the courtroom terminology. The parent in this study talked about being in court and the language within that as speaking gibberish to her. And she said that her advocate pretty much explained it to me in layman's terms, telling me in my own language what was going on. So when I stood there, dumbfounded, looking at the judge like, okay, looking at my lawyer, okay, I'm an idiot. I didn't understand any of that. That's when she's pretty much blurted it out in my own words, because they've been through it all and they know everything in and out. So they just put it in layman terms and guide you through it. And I think one of the kind of things I think is quite sad in the way that the parent in that study talked about was like the not understanding led to the conclusion that there's something wrong with her. Like she's the idiot for not making sense of this unbelievably complex and difficult space that she's found it in. And which is the experience of a professional when they're into that context for the first time. And so we can often become desensitized, I think, as professionals about the language barriers and how challenging some parents can find that. And then Lalient's, in her study of 21 parents, Lalient's research is some of the best research out there on this topic. I'd really highly recommend checking her work out. She talked about the mentors being able to speak their language literally and figuratively. So being able to explain things in a way that they could understand. And then the next key area was around the area of support. If you wouldn't mind moving on, Tim, please. Excellent. So parents, for example, in Berwick's study talked about receiving emotional, material and practical support from their mentors. Because the mentors had been through similar situations and now access similar services, they can typically have a really comprehensive understanding of what can be made available to them. And the other key finding was that it isn't just the emotional and practical support, but it was who provides that support, which was a key ingredient. So many parents in various different research studies would talk about how receiving the same advice or the same guidance from an advocate was much more readily received than receiving it from a professional, because it felt like it was coming from a genuine place of care and of somebody that had been in a similar situation. And the parental advocacy is not intended to replace social workers in terms of what their responsibility, but is instead a way of complementing the work that's already being done. So they're the kind of three areas that were identified in relation to parents who've been interviewed and subject to research in relation to receiving advocacy. And then if we move on to the next slide, please, Tim. We're going to look at social workers' views, because in addition to the advantages bestowed upon parents who'd received parental advocacy, there are also benefits to the social workers. And so it's kind of being acknowledged within the research that parental advocacy can facilitate engagement between the social workers and the parents, and it can increase the level of empathy for social workers for parents, because the advocate can translate some of the difficulties the parents experiencing towards the parent, towards the social worker, and then the social worker can have a better understanding and appreciation for their perspective. And there's this quote from a social worker here at the top, the first one, which I'll read out, so I just think it captures it really nicely. We may have an understanding of what our family is going through, but to have actually been there, like mentors have, it helps bridge that gap. Some families don't really want to communicate because caseworkers don't understand what they've gone through. I've had a couple of cases because of the mentor, I've had success with the family. Through the mentor, I was able to maintain a relationship with the client and communicate with her. And she ultimately ended up getting her kids back and did really well. If it had not been for the mentor, we probably would have not been successful in that case. So that really speaks to the power and the shift that can occur from parents being offered this type of support. And then in addition to benefits to the social workers, there was also benefits to the mentors, to the parental advocates. And there's a really good paper by Frank Reisman in 1965. It was wrote in 1965 about the value, I suppose, of parents or indeed any kind of person supporting other people when they've been through a similar situation themselves. So what Reisman writes here is that he was kind of advocating for social work to find ways to transform recipients of help into dispensers of help, thus reversing their roles, and to structure the situation so that the recipients of help will be placed in roles requiring the giving of assistance. And he argued that the helping role, if parents could be supported into that, could have a rehabilitative effect. It could help them in terms of a resolution of ambivalence around their own problems, because they're having to support and persuade others to make the right decisions. It has a benefit in terms of improved kind of social status, and a distraction from past kind of unhealthy patterns of behaviour. And then there's just this quote here in the middle that I think is really good, where it never lets me forget where I came from. It keeps me humble and keeps me sober. They, the families, give me more than I give them. To see their success, the daily impacts of my work, makes my life richer. Okay, and then the next slide, please, Tim. The other thing about the benefits for the mentors is that it often facilitated the development of professional skills, a sense of purpose, as well as kind of confidence and improved levels of self-esteem. And the distal goals, so again, to reference Tobis and Wilson's study of 100, analysis, sorry, of 100 studies, they found that parental advocacy reduces child maltreatment, improves the level of engagement with social workers, improves attendance at court hearings, can improve and reduce the number of children entering into care. And when children have been removed, it can increase the chance of reunification and help support with drug and alcohol issues. However, there's a kind of note of caution here in that the advocacy, the findings from these studies derive from different types of parental advocacy within different systems. And so that can make establishing the causal relationship between parental peer advocacy and outcomes difficult to precisely understand. But there's a lot of research that's being undertaken at the moment. For example, Clive Diaz has recently published some work in Camden, which I'm sure Tim will reference soon. But it's just to kind of acknowledge that there's further research to ensure that there's robust, defensible evidence, empirical evidence that's free from bias. And I think that might be all from me for now. I'm going to hand it back to Tim.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that you need allies, and we're going back to the practice context and Camden and the story of developing Camden's parental advocacy. And I'm listening to good people on the call, Carmen, Becca, Sue as well, Sue Felipe, and you need good people around to make that space for advocacy and to prepare the ground, to warm the context, if you like. And when we started out and in the Camden Conversations work, we had this kind of, at first we had sort of uncovered this daunting iceberg, which we kind of spotted, which was some of uncertainty in the service about this notion of not just parent advocacy, but this sense that we need to talk about the harm that the system does. And it was even a contested point that the system can do harm. And so having that conversation first was important. And we used these visual metaphors in the way that we helped aid as conversation aids, as to open up the spaces to have the real talk were quite key. I mean, we used the knitting wool back in the day in the first few coffee mornings that we had as a warm-up exercise and a way of feeling that we were building this connected network. And then this metaphor of the bridge emerged. That I mean, there's bridges all kinds of places, but Camden likes its bridges. There's bridges over the canal and Camden Lock, and that famous bridge in Camden near the market. So we cottoned onto that, and once we got going, and we had to think about what the activity of advocacy was, and we have a policy, and we thought about, you know, what were the expectations on peer advocates. And there is this kind of cycle with the Child Protection Conference of preparing, of the parent and the advocate preparing for it, the conference itself, and then the debrief. And so parent advocates entering into those little cycles with the parent that they were supporting. We found that a way to sort of help us think about it as something that could be done in the first place. I think when you look at it as this big open concept or idea, and all of that swirling emotional landscape and need and difficulty and poverty that's there in the community, so to give ourselves a bit of a handle on, you know, what is this thing that these advocates will be doing and they'll be offering to parents, and that little cycle of preparation, conference, debrief was something that was helpful. And for sure, the emotional territory around the work is really important. I mean, we've got people on the call that can talk better to this than me, and they might at the end. But you know, we've talked about love and some of the other fundamentals. Really, I think it comes back to that thing about, you know, you got to come handy with the evidence, and we've tried to do that through Camden Conversations and more recently with Clive and his work, collaborating with Rich, and really listening so keenly to the evidence that's coming through that it works, and coming with that in order to make the case in Camden, but also being aware that of the emotional landscape around it, and that it's, you know, back to that thing, it's not a tool or an intervention that you can just drop in, and so making the case for advocacy and connecting with it on those fundamental universal levels around love and care and need and reciprocal relationships and community, and time and history and all of those things, and oftentimes the family advisory board meetings or the conferences that we've organised, or the life story workshops that we hold in the King's Cross office, where we invite social workers in to talk with parents and community members around different topics. Those are trying to connect with the universal things, for sure. And I think that helps in the mechanisms we have for the emotional regulation of the work. All of those things are part of that support structure, part of that scaffolding of it. We also do have dedicated kind of supervision, and I'm available for advocates that need to discuss the work they're doing and the support that they're offering, and we have dedicated spaces and to talk about the advocacy work and bring advocates together, and that's really important. I mean, the funding and the independence one is a really big one. I mean, that one always makes me think from work that I was involved in, you know, nearly 20 years ago in Cardiff, when my first job post qualifying as a social worker was working for an advocacy charity and doing family good conference work. I did some work with the Welsh Government for a time around their national advocacy framework for children. And I mean, it's curious for me now to be in the situation of developing an advocacy program within the council as a local authority officer. And I'm really open to that perspective that, well, where's the independence in that? Let's talk about structure, let's talk about funding. And I think that is a really pertinent conversation that I think other places are already addressing. There's some really good advocacy work going on in Wales. But I think that's a really key question, which still needs to really be fully addressed, I think, in an English context. Yeah, Rich.
There's a lot of it's a really difficult dilemma that whether parental advocacy should be within the local authority or outside of the local authority, because if it is within the local authority, there's some issues around the degree to which the parents can really challenge the status quo in some sense. I've kind of leaned more towards parental advocacy being within the local authority, because I do think that as a statutory service, it should be embedded. But there's definitely advantages and disadvantages to either option. And as Tim alluded to, there's a kind of lively debate that could be had about that. So there are challenges to parental peer advocacy, and I'll just whiz through some of them because I'm mindful of the time. But I think it's important to acknowledge, because if we understand what some of the potential challenges are, then we can think about how you can set up parental advocacy in a way that mitigates against some of the potential issues that may arise. And this quote here by Frame et al., which is the inclusion of peer mentors in conventional child welfare, or to translate that to UK child protection practice, is hardly straightforward. And the challenges for some of the parent advocates is that they may have had limited pre-employment experience, so they might need training and ongoing support to understand the requirements of a power professional role. I know in the study recently undertaken by Clive in Camden, there was a debate about the degree to which advocates should be professionalised, and the merits and disadvantages of that in terms of it boosting their kind of sense of self-worth and identity, but also it runs the risk of them being a bit more detached, or being perceived as being more detached from the parents they're working with. If we move on to the next slide, please, Tim. Supervision is a really critical piece if we're going to think about offering parental advocates, or as a way of supporting them undertake the role. And there's the research kind of indicates that those who receive regular and supportive supervision were much more likely to remain in their roles and for longer periods of time. Although a lot of parent advocates in the research that we looked at expressed a lot of gratitude and satisfaction for the work that they did, there was obviously the kind of interpersonal dynamics that get played out in human relationships. And there was a need for advocates to be supported, as any individual who works with parents or families who are experiencing difficulty, to receive support around examining their relationships and to ensure that there's certain dynamics that don't interfere with the help that they're receiving. And then if we move on to the next one, please, Tim. This was just an interesting finding that I thought was worth noting about. Just because the parent advocate may have had similar experiences to the parent that they're supporting, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll have an automatic connection. So there does need to be some consideration into, is this the right advocate for this parent? And then the other element that Leek and their colleagues picked up on was around ensuring that we have ongoing performance measures as well as feedback, so that we can ensure that we're kind of making a positive difference. And then the final point is around system and cultural change, and how parental advocacy can run contrary to the dominant prescriptive professionally led approach to case management. I certainly know that when I was a child protection social worker, I would have found it really hard to hear the perspective of parents and some of their challenges, because when you're a child protection social worker, you're often working 50, 60 hours a week, you're under immense pressure. The parents are often dissatisfied because you're having to put their child on a child protection plan, or the professionals are unhappy because you're not quite as responsive as you were before. And then you're getting scrutinised by the independent reviewing officer or the child protection chair or your manager, etc., etc. And so I'm just being honest about my experience of hearing back the views of parents at that point in my career. And so there just needs to be some sensitivity and building the bridge between where social workers might be and how they think about helping families, and hearing some of the difficult feedback that parents need to give, and I think is important for us to listen to and receive. And then I'll just hand it back to you, Tim, I think, for the next one.
Yeah, and it's a real deep pleasure to listen to Rich in his dulcet tones set out the evidence, and to finish on giving you a bit of this is a bit of a visual on some of the elements we've been talking about in Camden, and we show you the email addresses in a moment, but we can provide those various different resources and that we've produced over time that might be useful to others that are developing advocacy in their area. We have been working with Telford Council, and there's some lovely things happened there. They did a really brave thing. We helped them facilitate this speak out session, and they got a lot of like professional senior people, social workers, early help service together with parents, and just kind of had this really important conversation, quite a difficult conversation, but also an important one, about getting that platform for expertise, for parent expertise to be recognised in their local authority. And it was absolutely fantastic. And what came out of that, and our support of them in developing their a parent group up there, was they took it in this really interesting creative direction, using a visual metaphor, interestingly, and their group is now called the Dandelion Group. And it was one of the parents that came to one of these sessions that we had, and came in one day and said he'd written something about the group, and he'd written this poem about the dandelion, and he talked about the dandelion and the dandelion seeds growing strong and being tightly bound together in order to share and grow strong, and then at the right point going off and spreading and seeding change in other places and in other parts of the community. And it really blew us away, and I think it spoke to the importance of that, allowing in some of the, whether it's, I never can remember whether it's your left side of your brain or your right side, but do you know what I mean? That idea that you're feeling it as well as thinking it, I think is important. And on that tip, in Camden, we have been sharing stories. I know these go out on Twitter as well, hashtag Camden Friday Story, but their main audience for them is internal, and we put them out over the local authority email every week. And there've been stories about all kinds of things, but our aim with them, their secret agenda is to spread these themes of reciprocity and community expertise. And we've had lots of stories about advocacy in the mix that we've shared with social workers, and that's been really key, actually, in raising awareness of it as a service and as an active offer for parents. And we have got some other ones coming up. Rich alluded to the research with Clive Diaz. Clive will be pleased, because I haven't sort of scotched his pancakes, and he can come and talk quite fresh to the research that he did in Camden, and he'll be coming on April the 25th. The focus of the next one that we have on March the 14th is fathers, isn't it, Rich?
Yeah, looking at kind of best practice and strategies, and Hopefully trying to come at that from a slightly different angle to some of the kind of conventional literature on the topic. Not because there's anything like there's loads of brilliant literature, and so it's to complement that, but we feel like there's an angle that we could potentially come at that might be or hopefully will be illuminating. And then later on in the year we've got participatory approaches, helping children and young people to amplify their voice in child protection, and looking at family group conferences and open adoption and other related issues. They're all on the Relational Activism website, which I'd highly recommend kind of checking out in any event, because it's got some really lovely videos and resources on there.
Yeah, and these webinars are all going up on the website, and do send us an email as well. You can contact us through the website or on our emails in Camden or Baines as well, and get in touch. I just saw on the screen actually